Hello everyone, welcome to our next training video in our series, The Lion and the Lamb, where we're looking at Revelation chapter 4 to 11, what is Jesus doing now and what it means for his church, and we're looking at Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 to 17, the six seals, and if you like, the first perspective. Now getting into the context of our passage, we need to remember what's happened before. The Lamb has taken the scroll and he is opening it. Don't forget, by the way, wherever we are in the book of Revelation, don't forget the seven churches to whom this letter or book is addressed to, who are struggling with complacency, compromise, and persecution. So always keep this in mind, the seven letters to the seven churches, what they were facing, because the visions address these issues, which seem to threaten God's people being his lampstand, ignited by his Spirit, to be a visible witness to his presence on earth in the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you recall, the visions begin, Revelation chapter 4 verse 1, with come up here and I will show you what must take place after this, meaning the last days that will unfold. And then we see the one who will initiate this, God on his throne, the Father on his throne, says, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And we know who it is, the Lamb. He, Jesus, the Lamb, went and took the scroll from the right hand of him. And if you recall, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father, the place of authority. He is worthy to take the scroll, God's plan of judgment and salvation, what must take place after this in the last days. He is worthy to break its seals, to unveil it, to reveal it, and to execute it. And that's what we see in the rest of the book, really. And in many ways, Revelation chapter 6 to 16, which is a unique part of the book, is a series of God's judgments on earth. And you'll notice there are interludes scattered in between the series of judgments. There are three. But maybe just to help us think through what we need to see in Revelation chapter 6 to 16, I want you to imagine this part of the book like a diamond. And what I mean by that is Revelation chapter 6 to 16 is about the last days, but it's not linear. What you're seeing at the moment is looking at the book of Revelation is looking at the last days from different perspectives, different angles. So if you can imagine the diamond as the last days, the different sequences of judgments and the interludes are looking at the last days, but from different perspectives, aspects, angles of the diamond, the last days. And so at the moment, Revelation 6, if you like, looks at the last days from this perspective with the six seals, and that is followed by a final judgment, which we'll see just now. Then it's followed by an interlude, which answers a question asked in this chapter in verse 17, who will stand? And that interlude is Revelation 7, which is looking at the church, because primarily, by the way, the interludes look at the church during the last days, Jesus' people. And so an interlude follows a series of judgments. Again, then we have the seventh seal and all the series of judgments, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, each one. The seventh one ends with the final judgment. As we see, final judgment, the sixth seal, which is a bit different, a break in the pattern, if you like. And the seventh trumpet, again, final judgment. And here we see again the seventh bowl, final judgment, all looking at the same event, the return of Christ, but from different perspectives. And so as the six seals look at it from this perspective of the last days, the seven trumpets look at it from this perspective, followed by another interlude, which, by the way, answers another question, because you'll notice chapter 9, verse 21 or 20 to 21, nobody repents, even though God is judging them. And so how will they repent? What do they need? They need a prophetic witness. They need the prophetic voice of God's people. Again, the role of the church during this time. So if you like, chapter 7 is about the church being protected during this time. Chapters 10 to 11 is about the church, God's people, witnessing their mission in this time. And again, this is followed by the seventh trumpet, final judgment again from a different perspective. That's sort of where we end so far in the series. But just to highlight for completion, there's another massive interlude about the dragon, the beast, and the seals, which is looking at the last days, also from a different perspective and where we fit in it. And then that's followed by the bowls, the six bowls, again from a different perspective, and then it ends with the final judgment. However, having said that, it's worthwhile pointing out each set of judgments, six seals, seven trumpets, followed by six bowls, increase in severity which again illustrates what Jesus said. As his coming comes closer, so the severity of the judgments, the birth pains, will increase. And so try and imagine chapter 6 to 16 like a diamond, and slowly but surely we're looking at the last days from every possible angle before we get to the break in the pattern, which is from chapter 17 onwards, with Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the return of the Lamb, and the various passages that follow. But looking at chapter 6, what is Revelation 6 focusing on? What's the angle? What's the perspective? It's really answering these three questions. What can we expect from world kingdoms during the last days as Jesus breaks the seals? What will the church experience in these world kingdoms during the last days? And then how will God the Lamb end this? And looking at the structure of our passage, the first four seals depict the world in chaos, looking at the four horses, which are quite well known and often misunderstood. The white horse of conquest, the red horse of anarchy, the black horse of famine and scarcity, and the pale yellowish green horse of death, which is then followed by the fifth seal, which is the persecuted church in this time, which is followed by the sixth seal, which is God ending it, answering their prayer, "How long, O Lord?" And once that period is done, God will end it, all evil. And so let's get into it, looking at the first four seals, which is the four horses. And just generally, as we get into it, as you see in our watch when the Lamb, and notice who's doing this, by the way, who's initiating all of this? The Lamb. So keep that in mind. Jesus is initiating all of this. And he breaks the seals, one of the seven seals, then a second seal. And notice what happens with each seal being broken. A horse comes forth. And notice who's calling them to come, the four living creatures who represent God and administer his justice. They call, "Come, come." They only come at the command of the living creatures. So again, notice the sovereignty of God here. This happens under God's sovereignty as the Lamb opens the seals and executes God's plan of judgment and salvation. And again, with a voice of thunder, and if you recall chapter 4, thunder is associated with God's judgment. And so we have these four horses. And worthwhile, these four horses in verses 1 to 8, we'll get to them, but just generally they echo Zechariah 1 and Zechariah 6. But there is a distinction, of course. So notice here Zechariah chapter 1. I saw in the night and behold a man riding a red horse. The colors here don't mean much, like in Revelation. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. And again, what are they doing, these horses? They patrol the earth. They patrol the earth. And notice what they're doing. As they are patrolling the earth, they are observing that the world is at rest. The world, the nations are at ease. Things are at rest. Notice the contrast. The horses that are unleashed in Revelation do not bring rest. They're not patrolling the earth in this sense to bring rest and ease. They're actually taking it away from the world in the place of rest. Because God is exceedingly angry at the nations, the dwellers of the earth, he takes away their rest, their ease, and in its place, chaos. And again, we see similarly Zechariah 6, verse 1 to 8, that idea of the different horses. Here it's chariots, 4 chariots. So again, similar but different. Red horses, black horses, white horses, dappled horses, all of them strong. And notice the 4 winds, that'll come up in chapter 7, by the way. Keep that in mind. And there's a little article about the 4 winds for you in the group guide. And they're patrolling the earth. Very similarly, this idea of ease and rest. So our horses are a bit different. In Revelation chapter 7, they're not here to bring ease. They're actually here to bring chaos, war and disorder. And again, this echoes what Jesus warned his disciples. If you can remember Matthew chapter 24, verse 6 to 7, what will the last days be like prior to his return? Wars and rumors of wars. Nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And now we're seeing this in visionary form. And so let's begin with the white horse, the first one that comes. And there's actually a logical order to these horses. The white horse, if you notice, has a bow. The rider here has a bow and a crown, and he is given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. A bow, by the way, in the Old Testament is about war and military power. And in these passages, you see God's judgment breaks those bows. Crowns are given in victory and symbolize rule. You see this in 2 Samuel as David conquers and takes the crown of his enemy. And similarly in the New Testament, this imagery of a crown is used for victory. And so here we have a conquering horse sent out to conquer, conquest. And if you like, it's a picture of what we see in world history where kingdoms conquer other kingdoms, imperialism. And the figure, by the way, the reason he's white and he has a crown is he looks very messianic, but he's not, because when you compare him to Revelation 19, although Jesus is dressed in white here, he is crowned with many crowns. His weapon is not a bow, but the sword of his mouth. And so this is not Jesus. This is a false Messiah. And Jesus warns us of these false rulers, these false Christs that will arise in the last days. And evil, because it's white, will project itself as righteous. And it's worthwhile to point out that imperial expansion, by the way, always happens under the guise of seeming righteousness and justification. But what follows this imperial urge in world kingdoms to conquer one another? It's the second seal. And I heard the second living creature saying, "Come," and notice there's a red horse now. And again, the colors, by the way, correspond to what they do. This red horse represents anarchy. Notice its rider was permitted to take peace, unlike the riders in Zechariah. Take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. So what usually follows conquest is anarchy. You go study world history, you will see this over and over and over. And by the way, it's a picture of God's judgment. Anarchy is a sign of partial judgment, judgment from God. Notice this, Zechariah 14:13. On that day, great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, those under his judgment, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of another. Anarchy. And here, look at this judgment against the Egyptians. And I will stir up the Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight each against another, each against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. And this is what we actually see the red horse do. They are slaying one another. There's no peace between them. And what follows imperial conquest and war and anarchy is the black horse. When he opened the third seal, again, the third living creature says, "Come," representing God. And I looked at a black horse, and notice what he does. And its rider had a pair of scales used in trade, measuring the value of something and what it needs to be paid. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures. Notice, a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine, the luxuries. Again, this represents scarcity and inflation. This always follows war and civil war, scarcity and inflation. We're actually experiencing it now in our world, in many parts of our world. And the food prices mentioned here, by the way, are 10 to 12 times higher than the normal price in the first century. It's the equivalent of a bread that cost 20 rand is now 200 to 240 rand because it's scarce. Famine and scarcity always follow war and anarchy. For example, and again, this is a judgment from God. You can just look at all these passages, and there are many others. But just look at how God describes the siege of Jerusalem as they are being conquered by another kingdom in conquest. Son of man, behold, and the anarchy, by the way, that breaks out between the people of Israel as well. Son of man, behold, I break the supply of bread in Jerusalem. They shall eat bread by weight and with anxiety. And they shall drink water by measure and in dismay, because it's scarce. And I will do this, that they may lack bread and water, look at one another in dismay, and rot away because of their punishment. So again, this is a sign of God's judgment. And remember who is breaking the seal, who is initiating this? The Lamb. Why the oil and wine is left? Trees, by the way, the trees of vineyards and so forth usually survive wars and civil war. They're the luxury items. And curiously enough, during this time, Domitian ordered at a stage the removal of half the vineyards of the provinces because he felt there was too much production of wine. We needed more wheat. But people really loved their wine. They'd rather be drunk than eat. And due to public outcry, he actually repealed his command. You can read about this if you like in Suetonius' Life of the 12 Caesars. So that might help you understand why this is mentioned explicitly. But then what follows? Conquest, kingdoms crushing other kingdoms, anarchy as people fight one another, and scarcity and inflation is the fourth seal that he opens, Jesus. And the fourth living creature says, "Come," and here comes a pale horse, directly translated, by the way, a yellowish green horse. It's the color of a corpse. And in many ways, the final horse is a summary of the consequence of all the other three: death. And again, the means of death mentioned here, by the way, with the sword, with famine, with pestilence, by wild beasts of the earth, which we just saw in the other horses, as people flee into the countryside and into the wildernesses, as people suffer famine and the blade of the sword and the pestilence that follows the famine, which you see throughout world history. These are echoes of God's judgments in the law. I hope you see the strong continuity Revelation depicts between the Old Testament judgments and the current events of chaos we experience in the last days. There's a powerful continuity. And remember who's initiating this. The Lamb, who was slain by the world, is initiating this. And again, keep the 7 letters in mind. This is a powerful warning to churches like Laodicea, who are rich in these kingdoms, who find and seek security in these kingdoms. And this is a warning. It'll end. But it's also an encouragement. Notice it's a fourth. It's not everywhere and not everything. These are birth pains. They are actually signals to us who are on earth. Jesus is coming. The birth pains have begun. Be encouraged. He is coming. But then what follows is the fifth seal in verses 9 to 11. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar, significantly, the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witnesses they bore. So notice how the kingdoms of this world will treat Jesus' people. They will be killed, martyred, persecuted. And this is a major theme in the letter. Remember the churches of Smyrna and Pergamum and Philadelphia. We'll later see the 2 witnesses killed by the beast, and the beast killing God's people. Persecution is a major theme. The curious thing is, why are they seen under the altar? And the altar is part of the Old Testament sacrificial system, where the blood of the animals was used, by the way, in Old Testament worship. And blood, by the way, represented life. And here we see again a strong continuity between the Old Testament sacrificial system and the Christian life. The Apostle Paul uses this Old Testament sacrificial imagery to describe his life, Christians' lives, as a living sacrifice to God, and he describes his own life prior to martyrdom as a drink offering to God. Our lives are sacrificial offerings to God, and so also our martyrdom if we should be killed for the faith. Our life, our blood is precious in his sight. It's like a drink offering to God. It's worth noting that Jesus' own death is described in Old Testament sacrificial language, and we are called to follow him. As Jesus was crucified, so we're called to take up our cross and follow him, Jesus. Follow me, Jesus. How profound to think that in Christ our very lives, because of his own sacrificial death, cleansing us from all impurities, our lives are then presented to God as living sacrifices, drink offerings, pleasing to God as we follow him in this world. But they have a cry. They cried out in a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true," appealing to his character. "How long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" This "how long" echoes the psalmists and the prophets appeal to God's character to administer justice and mercy. You see this in Moses, Ezekiel, the Psalms, Habakkuk, just to mention a few, but there are many others. The term here, "those who dwell on the earth," is a negative phrase describing humanity in rebellion against God and the Lamb, which you'll see throughout the book of Revelation. So this is not a reference to God's people on earth, but those in rebellion against God on earth. And they're asking for God to administer justice. And again, there's a contrast here between us who have a citizenship of the New Jerusalem, the new creation, as described here in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20 to 21, versus those whose citizenship is on earth, worldly kingdoms, and the saints in heaven are calling for justice. And then God answers them by giving them a white robe. And remember, the white robe is the promise Jesus gives his people throughout the book of Revelation, which began in the 7 letters. He tells them to rest a bit longer. Notice why: until the number of their fellow servants and brothers should be complete. There are still many disciples, saints, people from all tribes, peoples, languages to be brought into God's people, fellow servants and brothers. And only until that number is complete. And those who will also have to suffer, be killed as they themselves had been. So there's a number of martyrs to be completed. Only when that happens, then the final judgment will come. But to show us what it will be like, we have the 6th seal in verses 12 to 17. When he opened the 6th seal, notice this description here. I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, the moon became like blood, the full moon and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. This is like decreation, the entire creation unraveling. Great earthquake, sun, moon, star, skies. This is Old Testament imagery, by the way, of the day of the Lord. You can go look it up. This is the imagery of the day of the Lord is taken up by Jesus. And this describes his return. When he returns, the day of the Lord, the final day of judgment, which will look like this, by the way, will be administered. The apostles repeat the same imagery to describe the return of Jesus, like the apostle Peter here. What are you seeing? You are seeing, as Revelation 20 and 21 would describe it, the vanishing, the end of the old order of creation subjected to futility and decay, waiting for its renewal, the new creation. And it's worth mentioning the reason, by the way, the event surrounding Jesus' crucifixion mirrors the day of the Lord. You go look Matthew 27, if you recall, when we did Matthew, is that Jesus suffered and absorbed the judgment of the day of the Lord on the cross, so that you would not on that day if you take refuge in him. But those who did not take refuge in Jesus, those who did not wash their sins away in the blood of the Lamb, if you like, as chapter 7 would describe them, the kings of the earth, notice how all-encompassing this is, the great ones, the generals, these are the rich and powerful, everyone, slave or free, doesn't matter your class, doesn't matter where you're from, if you're not in the Lamb, you are facing his judgment. Notice their response, like Adam and Eve in the garden. They tried to hide themselves. They hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us. Why? From the face of him who's seated on the throne. And notice this, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day, the day of the Lord, of their wrath has come. Now they will face the full might of God's justice. And then they ask a question in terror. And who can stand? That'll be answered in Revelation chapter 7. But what do you want to walk away with? Take home. Understand that the current chaos in the world kingdoms that we see are partial judgments from the Lamb, opening the seals and executing the content of the scroll. You could look at every war and news excerpt you see of civil war and famine and scarcity because of these things and the death ensued. Revelation chapter 6 verse 1 to 8 is your answer. This is what's happening. And it's a warning. Don't put your hope and trust in world kingdoms. They will fall. And understand that world kingdoms will be hostile. They're not your allies. They will be hostile to Jesus' people, the church. But this is where you need to put your hope. Be encouraged by God's final judgment. He will end all evil. And this is what you need to take away from Revelation chapter 6 as Jesus opens the seals.